Let's take a look at mosses on some of the different substrates in Ohio. For example, farm fields or abandoned farm fields, what we call arable land. Here's an area that was farmland until recently, and then it's being transformed into a lovely wet prairie restoration in Battelle Darby Metro Park. And here on the ground, in this bare soil, is a cushion moss, an acrocarp, with light-colored leaves that are sort of lance-shaped with a claw-like tip. It's called claw moss, Barbula unguiculata. Here are the sporophytes. The sporophytes are long and narrow. Here's another moss that's in the same family as that claw moss. It's called Vicia, and it's got leaves that are narrow also. Here's a moss that has virtually no sporophyte that you can see evidently because the seta, the stalk, is very short and it's enveloped by these triangular basal leaves. So there are sporophytes there, but you'd have to tease it apart to see them. Here are sporophytes of two mosses that are closely related. The upright one is called goblet moss, and the curved one is called fire moss or cord moss. Here's some detail of the sporophytes of that cord moss / fire moss, Funaria hygrometrica. Here's a moss that's common not only in farm fields but also in city sidewalks. It's called silvery bryum. The gametophytes have leaf cells that are clear, that don't have chlorophyll in them, so it has a whitish, sort of shiny appearance. And the sporophytes are fairly tall with nodding capsules. Here are the sporophytes of the silvery bryum with the sporophytes of the claw moss. Here's a different kind of bryum that reproduces asexually. So on the rhizoids of the base of the plant are these kind of potato-like tubers that can break apart and form new plants. Some other mosses on the ground, also there's some overlap here. Here's a mound of soil in Marion County that has two of those Dicranum species. Dicranum, you might recall, is a moss with fairly narrow leaves. Here's a very common species called broom moss, Dicranum scoparium. It is a closely related species that's called Dicranum polysedum. These leaves aren't swept to one side, and they're not quite as narrow, and they're wrinkled. Here's another instance of pigtail moss, Vicia controversa, showing a feature of it that is fairly distinctive. The leaves are curled upwards. Here's a similar species that also has leaves that are curled upwards, but instead of having a tall sporophyte with a seta, it's got a short sessile capsule without a evident seta. Here's a railroad track in Powell that's got a great amount of fire moss / cord moss, Funaria hygrometrica. See the gametophytes at the bottom and the sporophytes at the top? These sporophytes are twisty, and slowly but surely, when the humidity changes, they twist and turn, helping to disperse the spores. This is when they're dispersing the spores. Fire moss. Here's a residential lawn in northern Ohio that's damp and shady, and it's got a great population of tree moss, Glymaceum americanum. These are the leaves of tree moss that is sort of ear-shaped at the base, and the stems of tree moss have these filamentous, what are called paraphilia. They probably help wick water up the stem, because remember, mosses are non-vascular. Here's tree moss with sporophytes. Here's a very common moss. It's called Plagionium cuspidatum. It occurs on the soil and occurs on bark, on bark of fallen logs, and also on rock. And it has fairly broad leaves, reminiscent to me of like a cherry tree. On the right, you see the leaves that are toothed halfway to the margin. On the left, you see the sporophytes with their 16 teeth on the outside and some segments on the inside, double peristome. Here are the leaves of another species of Plagionium that can be distinguished by the fact that they're toothed all the way to the base. Here's a little, some kind of a sewer pylon, manhole, person hole thing. Anyway, fairly disturbed site, and it's got this moss called Ceratodon purpureus. Its sporophytes have these lovely red seta, and it gives it a nice purple look. Ceratodon purpureus. It does well in nutrient-poor conditions, like this little metal slag heap. Logs. Logs are a good substrate for bryophytes because they're not good substrates for vascular plants. Here's a log on the forest floor in west central Ohio, and it's got this moss that kind of suggests a fern. It's called Thuidium. Like the Climacium, it's got paraphylia on the stem, little appendages, sort of scale-like appendages that probably help wick water along the stem. Remember, these are non-vascular plants. Here's another log in another location, and it's got a carpet moss, a pleurocarp, that's more feathery. And it has leaves that are sickle-shaped. Here are the leaves through the microscope, looking long and attenuate and curved at the tip. Bark. Bark is a good substrate for bryophytes, especially ones that can dry out very well. So here's a tree trunk, and here on the tree trunk is this little bristle moss, Orthotrichum pusillum. And it, I guess because the sporophytes are already up in the air, they don't need to be elevated further, so they have immersed sporophytes with barely a seta. One of the peculiarities of identifying the different species of Orthotrichum is that you actually sometimes are directed to look at the stomates, the breathing pores. Moss sporophytes have stomata. Moss gametophytes, in fact, no bryophyte gametophytes have stomata, but the sporophytes do. So here's a picture that shows that the sporophytes are sunken into the tissues of the capsule. Here's another moss that has slightly elevated sporophytes, and it's very crispy when it's dry. It's called crispy tuft moss, Eulota crispa. Now it's actually called Eulota crispula. Here's one that grows in damp little crevices in the crotches of branches of trees. It's called knothole moss, Anacamptodon splachnoides. Here's a moss that wraps itself around the base of trees. It's super, super, super common. It's called Anomodon attenuatus, and its branches are tapered, so it gives it a distinctive look. That's where the word attenuatus comes from. It's attenuate. Here's the tips of Anomodon. Through the microscope, the leaves look very opaque because the cells have many papillae on them, many bumps. So, rock. Rock is a good place for mosses to grow. Here's a limestone bluff along the Scioto River near Fissinger Road in Franklin County. And it's covered with this beautiful species of Anomodon called Anomodon minor. It's got blunt leaves and it's sort of flattened looking. Here's another species of Anomodon called Anomodon rostratus, which has more attenuate leaves that are drawn to a little tip. Here's the tip of that Anomodon rostratus. Here's a rock in central Ohio. It's a glacial erratic boulder, and it's got two organisms growing on it. One is a crustose lichen in the center, but the subject of our attention now is this moss that looks like hair growing on it, and it's a kind of a dicranum. It's Dicranum fulvum, and it's one of several mosses that grow on rocks. It has linear leaves like most species of dicranum do. Here's a moss that is sometimes called Medusa moss, I guess because it has this big eye-like sporangium. The sporophytes don't have stalky seta, and it has leaves that have clear tips. This is what they look like through the microscope. And what's cool about Hedwigia is how different it looks when it's wet versus when it's dry. This is Hedwigia dry. This is Hedwigia wet. Mosses are capable of drying out and not being harmed, and they can persist over long periods in the dry state and then perk up when it gets wet. Here's another moss that grows on rocks. It's called Orthotrichum strangulatum, and it's a cushion moss with hairy calyptra. Here's a species of Eulota, similar to that one we just saw a few minutes ago on trees, with the grows on rocks. And here's a famous moss. It's called apple moss. And apple moss is easier to use than Windows moss, but it's a little bit more expensive. So that's a little overview of some of the substrates that mosses grow on, and some of the different types of mosses that grow there.